When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This, my friends, is where it all began. This is the foundational document of American principles, the Declaration of Independence. Now, what we need to understand first about the Declaration is it is not a legal document. This is not something that you can use when you go into court to defend yourself. Hey, the Declaration of Independence says this, but at the same time, this document is even more important than legal documents because it defines the principles that make America what it is and the values that we all share, the fundamental values that we have in this country, including limited government, natural rights, popular sovereignty, republicanism, and the social contract. I'm going to first continue to read from the preamble and then explain how these 5 principles of American democracy are defined by the Declaration of Independence, which again does not set up a plan for government, but just starts the process of forming our country. And every principle that we have in our government somehow goes back to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, first of all, we want to note that the Declaration of Independence espouses the principle of limited government, that the power of government only goes so far. Now, I'm not going to get into the long train of abuses and usurpations where Jefferson lists every way that he can think of that King George III has violated principles of limited government. That's really more for a U.S. history course, but it's the most fun part of the document to read. But this idea that the government's powers are limited and that the government comes from the people, this idea of popular sovereignty, that government is not a top-down thing, that it's something that the people create. They create this through a social contract. Now, when we look at social contract theory, this is getting into Enlightenment philosophy and the philosophy specifically of John Locke, where we see life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We see an appeal to John Locke, who a century before had written about life, liberty, and property. Now, when we think about the pursuit of happiness, this is expanding things because when you think about it, what makes you happy? Accumulating property makes you happy, but it's bigger than that. It is also being able to decide things like what you will do for a living. For example, nobody forced me to become a teacher. I decided to pursue teacher certification. Now, again, when we look at the pursuit of happiness, that I have the right to strive for happiness, I also did not have the right to get a job, that once I had my certificate, I still had to go through the process of applying for a job. So what we see here is the idea of negative liberty. Now, negative liberty is not a bad thing. Negative liberty is just the liberty that we have from government leaving us alone. So when we think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it reflects the belief that government should stay out of my way unless I, as a citizen, along with my fellow citizens, have freely delegated a power to the government and said, government, take care of this for me. Take care of protecting my person, my life, my liberty, my right to express myself, and my property, that I don't want to be afraid of my property being taken away from me. And this is where we see where King George III and the British government violated the social contract by seizing the property of Americans, by threatening their liberties and threatening their lives. This guy was sending troops to come shoot at us, after all. So with that, we also want to note the principle of republicanism, which also states that government needs to be controlled by the people, that the people select representatives to administer the government on their behalf. Now, this is, of course, not monarchy, where the government starts with the monarch. And so we think about what happened during the American Revolution, or right before, when the king said, you know what, we are disbanding the legislature of Massachusetts, and I'm going to send a general over there who's going to function as a martial law dictator. That violates a principle of republicanism, that government needs to come from the people. So we think about this whole idea of natural rights, okay, that there are rights that people have, and the government's responsibility is to protect these fundamental rights. So we see the Constitution and the whole foundation of our American legal system, although the Declaration of Independence is not a legal document, in a lot of ways it supersedes it because it puts American principles out there. And we also want to note here that the Declaration of Independence, the way that we understand it, has changed over time. When Jefferson originally wrote that all men are created equal, and that was ratified by the Continental Congress, they weren't thinking of it the way that we think of it today. It certainly didn't include women. It didn't include people who were enslaved. And we have seen, as we've gone forward as a nation, we have seen the original promise of the Declaration of Independence, whereas all men are created equal initially just was a protest against hereditary nobility and the idea that people who were born in Britain were somehow better than people who were born in the colonies. It was, as people understood it at that time, very limited to say that we, the elites here from the colonies at the Continental Congress, are declaring our independence and saying that we are just as good as you. And we have seen where over time this is applying now to everyone, that when we say today all men are created equal, it has a much more expansive view of liberty than the framers initially conceived, and that's okay. And of course, that's where we connect this to Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which then is taking these principles that, hey, this declaration said that all men are created equal, but look at the society that we have now, that we're not realizing the promise of Jefferson's words and the way to expand the meaning of this. So remember that when we think about the Declaration of Independence, we think about it as the foundation of American liberty and the foundation of an American liberty that has expanded over time. And with that, you've got the basic principles of the Declaration of Independence. It is always a pleasure.